Hello, my name is Jorb. I love gear, and this is the Super 6. It's kind of heavy. You are looking at the desktop version. There's, of course, also a keyboard version. I have it on a short-term loan from the US distributor. Jeff, thank you for reaching out and sending this over. But what is it? It is a 12-voice digital analog hybrid binaural polysynth. And it highlights something I think is really, really interesting about the synth market. The Super 6 is undoubtedly a flagship, right? It is clearly a very nice premium product. It's priced as such, but it's totally different to the other flagships. Things like the Polybrute, the Moog 1, the Hydrosynth Deluxe, or closest technologically, at least to the Oscillators, the Novation Summit. Each and every one of those is totally different. And on some level, they all start with, let's make a really nice synthesizer. But the answer for each company and each product ends up being very different. Here on the Super 6, that combination of decisions that makes it a top-of-the-line product is FPGA-based oscillators with some modern digital tricks, classic analog filters, analog VCAs, some options to manipulate the sound differently in the left and right channels to manipulate the stereo field. They call it binaural. There are no screens, and it's all wrapped up in a beautiful, beautiful case, clearly inspired by classic synthesizers. And specifically, we see Roland inspired thrown around a lot when people are talking about the Super 6. And that was sort of my starting point, what I expected coming into it, but it's really not that simple. The borderline superficial inspirations are really, really clear. Things like faders over knobs, even the layout of each module, using a bender instead of pitch and mod wheels on the keyboard version. But there is Roland DNA in really impactful decisions as well, having delay on the two LFOs, a very simple chorus, no controls, just a button for mode 1, mode 2, and this has a mode 3 as well. But some of the stuff I see as very important to a lot of the Roland polysynths is very, very different. We do not have simultaneous waveforms, which I think of for the Juno at least, and the filter isn't necessarily a Roland-inspired design. So this is not really a clone. This is a totally modern, unique instrument with some very clear inspiration. And that inspiration is an element of the total package. It is by far from the entire story. So if you were expecting something that sounded sonically like a Jupiter 6, or for that matter, a Juno or JX, it does not. And it never was supposed to. It was never trying to be that. But if you want a synth that's great sounding, completely full of sweet spots, and shares a similar enough hands-on approach to those old synthesizers, then you're in luck. When I first sat down, unboxed the unit, started using it, my first impressions were this as a physical object. This as a product feels great. It feels somehow classy. And the build quality, the feel of the faders, really everything. This is probably the most premium synthesizer I've ever had my hands on. Let's talk about individual modules. Let's start with the oscillators. They're FPGA based, and FPGA is field programmable gate array, I believe. The first time I heard about this, I don't know if the right word is technology or methodology, but I first heard of it in emulating old video game consoles. Here on the Super 6, they're referred to as DDS 1 and 2, and it's digital waveforms that get sampled at a really, really high frequency, and then that gets converted into a voltage to run through the rest of the signal path. And after it's converted to a voltage, it drives an analog filter and an analog VCA. And I think in theory, that's the most flexible way to do an oscillator. You can be super precise. You have the option for really, really complex waveforms, but if you want standard geometric waveforms, you can do that. If you want it to be less precise, you can dial in drift. I feel like the digital waveforms on the Super 6 give a lot of its potential for its most unique timbral range, and that's the first thing that gives us that sort of PPG vibe, even without wavetables like it would have had, or wave scanning, I suppose. Having these really harmonically rich digital waves through an analog filter is a great combination and seems to be sort of inspired by the PPG. I don't want to say that the blue of the keyboard version is an indirect reference to that, but it feels like it is, and it's an homage that I would expect from something like this that is all clearly inspired by the classics. And to further that line of thought, the filter chips are the SSI 2144, which is a modern recreation of the SSM 2044. And the SSM 2044 is what was in the later iterations of the PPG, along with the Poly 6 and I think the along with the Poly 6 and I think the Monopoly as well. So I think it's a great filter choice and has some significance to being used with digital waves, which they of course sound great. And I want to specifically compliment the drive switch. The drive switch, I left it in the first position almost all the time because that felt to me like it was just compensating for any bass loss when you turned up the resonance. I really, really like that. That's one of the things I like about Prophet style filters. So just talking about those two sections between the oscillator and the filter, which is where a lot of your character is going to be derived, the oscillators are very, very interesting because of the digital waves. There's a few modulation things I would like. Yes, it would be nice if there were wavetables. Yes, we know FPGAs are capable of that, but they still sound very, very good. And the digital waves they give you are interesting, and there's more released all the time, and I believe you can make your own. That is a massive, massive amount of flexibility. And the filter sounds good. That's exactly what an analog filter is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to sound good. At the core of its sound generation, the Super 6 has a very, very, very strong start. But onto probably my biggest complaint, modulation. So maybe I'm spoiled, okay, by digital mod matrices in synths that have screens and are built to expect you to do your modulation like that. I think about the Take 5, I think about the DeepMind, but I feel like the Super 6 is missing a few things, or at least gets them wrong. So totally surface level, you have 8 sources and 8 destinations that you can route modulation between, and you have a variable amount that is positive or negative. That's all well and good. You can also modulate most of the panel controls, and you move a fader to point that modulation there, so to speak, which is nice, but there is no way to see which of those modulations are already set up when you come to a new patch. I could have LFO2 routed somewhere, and I would never know it until I went into the mod matrix and I moved every fader until I found the one that happened to have modulation set up. Now, there is a way to reset all your modulations, but to come back to a patch or to explore ones that are already set up is kind of lost on that. I think that's a bummer, and that is a function of the way the panel is laid out and the fact that it is hands-on and there's no screen. All of that is intentional, and this is just a very unfortunate downside of that. And I think that complaint is because I'm spoiled by mod matrices with screens. But I think there's a few missing sources. So the only sources you have are the 8 that are on the panel buttons. So that's a little different between the keyboard version and the desktop version. But the keyboard version has bender up and bender down for what can be pitch or filter mod. Okay. And yes, the desktop has the pitch wheel as a mod source, but the desktop model cannot reroute the mod wheel. I understand on the keyboard version, maybe you don't need that because it's very short travel and it just brings in LFO2. But on the desktop version, if I want to route the mod wheel to the filter, I can't. And we already have a button for aftertouch. Why can't I press that twice to get to the mod wheel? Or why can't I use the mod wheel / aftertouch button that's in the LFO section to pick the mod wheel as a source? Because we already have a button for aftertouch. It feels like that option is right there, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be included here. And maybe that's just the way I like to program, but one of the first things I want to do is add a performance element with the mod wheel. And I know it's not, just happening in analog circuitry or whatever because it's coming through MIDI. I know that can be routed to another place. That just feels like a miss to me. Anyway, also missing from the sources is LFO1, the LFO that can be binaural, which is a big part of how this thing is marketed. You cannot route that to any destinations that are not on the panel already. And without getting too far ahead of myself, a lot of the destinations for LFO1 don't actually behave differently when you're using a binaural LFO1. That is a little bit ahead of myself, but I'll just flow right into it. Let's talk about the binaural stuff. a big part of the marketing for the Super 6 is its binaural capabilities. And the binaural switch right on the front turns the 12 voices into 6 pairs of 2, and 1 panned left, 1 panned right for every pair. So you press one note, it triggers 2 voices that are getting the same note data, but they're panned left and right. And they can have a few differences between them. For one, if you use DDS1 and you're using the Super Wave, or Super DDS, I suppose they call it, the detune will be a little bit different in your left and your right. You'll hear stereo imaging from that. If you use drift, I believe drift will be a little bit different in each ear when you have paired oscillators, but a lot of your movement, a lot of your difference between your left and right happens with LFO1. LFO1 has a slider that changes your left and right relative phase, and near 60% or somewhere near the middle, they are exactly out of phase. So when a modulation is high on your left, it is low on your right, and vice versa. And there are a few destinations that have a huge effect on the way you hear sound with that. And I'm a Rhodes guy, so I'm going to bring it up. The Rhodes stereo tremolo, the Rhodes panning tremolo is a huge part of what makes those things special. And here we have that incorporated in the panel. And even though it feels so simple, it is a massive difference to what you're hearing in your head. And when you're not, just to mention it now, when you're not in binaural mode, you can pan individual voices around the stereo field. Another thing that's very important, and part of why the Oberheim polys are legendary is because they did that. So yes, the binaural options have a massive effect on my perception of the sound coming out of the synth, but there's a few things that I feel like I should be able to modulate that I can't. You cannot modulate the pitch of DDS1 differently in your left and right. And they have an explanation in the manual. I don't really understand it, because if I'm in 12 voice mode, I can have a different pitch for each voice, right? So why then can't I modulate them differently? Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but it's not like, you know, we have one note value that cannot move away from these 2 paired voices. And that might be me admitting to being a simpleton. I digress. You can modulate the pitch of DDS2 with inverted phase, but it is all simple geometric waveforms. But you cannot modulate pulse width differently in your left and right, which you can only do on DDS2 in the first place. And that again is like, and maybe I don't understand the limitation, but why couldn't that have been overcome? Because now the only things we can modulate with the binaural LFO are the VCA, the VCF, and the pitch of one of our oscillators. And I'm going to look at the panel. Yeah, I really do think that's all, is the LFO, the VCA, and the pitch of DDS2. And so for it to be hyped up so much and to be such an integral part of the way this thing is presented, it seems like it's missing a lot of cool options. I sort of, and maybe wrongfully so, expected a lot of really flexible options for manipulating things in the stereo field. I would have loved simply a flat detune between the left and right, maybe paired with, you know, a variable amount of panning instead of relying on drift to get us there, because we can. There is a knob for detune, but it only works when you're using the Super DDS mode. So maybe when Super DDS is off, why can't that detune, flat detune, when they're paired left and right? And maybe we can have oscillators panned differently left and right, and maybe we can modulate them back and forth in phase. So you alternate hearing DDS1 on your right and your left, on your right and your left, opposite to DDS2. Or why not put LFO1, the binaural LFO, in the mod matrix, and anything it can't modulate binaurally, just don't let that be modulated. Just go, you know, with the single phase LFO1 or whatever. And I guess I could riff off little wants for a while, or I could just summarize and say the binaural stuff is cool and it's a powerful effect, but I really wish that it went a little further. I feel like that was a lot of negatives, and I don't like that. So I'll go back to what I think the Super 6 is very good at. If I sit and use it like, I'll use my Juno specifically, because it is my Rolandy, fader-laden, hands-on, old synthesizer, where the experience of patching is somewhat limited by the panel control, and you just approach it knowing that's everything you have, you end up using the right amount of every control, if that makes sense. You add just enough resonance, you pay attention to the high-pass filter, you pay attention to your envelope amount, your LFO amount, all those things, and as the sound sort of comes out, you realize that there are other parameters that now would be better suited for the last change you made. You can get amazing sounds in that way, just sitting down and pushing faders as one inspires you to move to the next. And using the Super 6 like that feels really, really good, and it nails that experience. Just use what's on the panel, because there is so much potential for interesting, rich sounds just with the panel controls, even ignoring the shift functions in a lot of cases. And I think that's really important to the way I like to sit and use synthesizers. And for a modern synthesizer to capture that so effectively really, really does impress me. But I guess I'll flow right into my conclusion from that. I don't have enough use for it at this point to put up the cash for it. I would like to have it. I would like to keep it. But it's expensive. It's really a lot. And I'm sure I will miss it when I send this loaner back. Anyway, me not having the money aside, it's a hands-on approach that's almost understated in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it gets me excited to sit down and use it. And that part they really, really nailed. And I hope to see other synths attempt to do that, to really, really feel like that. It's not a reissue, but it has the spirit of sitting and using an old synth. That's exactly what I want. And to wrap up all my negatives, this might seem a little weird, but just trust me, okay? The firmware's current version is 0.30. That's the most recent one on the website, and that to me implies it's still some description of unfinished. And while a lot of my specific complaints can be worked out in firmware, which is good, and I hope that some of them do change, there's a lot of things that might require a combination of shift functions or button holds that are not on the panel, and in a way that undermines the hands-on nature of using this synth. Now, I know I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, that I liked the sensation of sitting down and ignoring the deeper functions. And the deeper functions should be readily available, but I guess I just mean to say I can't help but wonder if the hardware layout, the panel layout, might have changed if the software had been refined a little bit before things went to manufacturing. And I don't mean whole new faders, buttons, or switches. I mean even as simple as shift functions in different places, or shift functions over the parameters that didn't have them to afford a little bit more control. And maybe I just expect a lot of control because to me this is about as expensive as it gets, and I sort of have that direct correlation in my mind. If a synth is premium, and this certainly is, it should be very flexible and it should have well thought out control, and I shouldn't be left wondering why is this missing, because somebody else should have gone through that whole thought process by now. So to really conclude, the Super 6 feels very premium, and even if I would like a bit more control at this price point, it succeeded in what I see or I interpret as its main goal, to put powerful modern sounds in a piece of hardware that feels just as hands-on and just as classic as the actual classics. So there you go. My name's Jorb. I love gear. I love the Super 6. I love what it indicates about the market, and I love what it's attempting to do, because I want to see more synths try and do that. And I want more synths to feel just like this. So there you go. Thank you for watching. My name's Jorb. I love gear. Cheers and so long.